Greenland has come and gone, and have moved on from it. I think it's worth remembering that it was only a couple of weeks ago that European forces were being moved into Greenland
Right,
to defend against a potential act of aggression by the United States.
right.
Okay, that is not going to be unremembered by the rest of the world, even if we would like to get past it right now. That is a turning point in history, something that was unimaginable at any time in the last 80 years. Let's not treat it as if it was a blip on the screen. And the forces that support Donald Trump in the United States, even after Trump is gone, they're still going to be here. It's not as if this was Harry Truman's America before Donald Trump. And in this sense, I agree with Amitav. The consensus among public opinion in the United States in both parties was very disenchanted with the global order that the United States had responsibility for upholding. It wasn't just Trump who said we're being ripped off in this system. Democrats felt that way about trade, etc. So the notion that once Trump is gone, we're back to Dean Acheson and the old boys back in the 1950s is not true. I think that we have been in a long trough in the United States, a long period of disenchantment with the American role. That's one reason Trump got elected again. He ran on America first and won. Doesn't that tell us something about the state of American public opinion? So I just think the reason people say, oh, well, it'll be all fine after Trump is gone, is it relieves them of the burden of having to do anything now.
Yeah,
And I think it is really very much in accord with the appeasement approach that Mark Rutte and others have been taking. And it's just an excuse for Europeans and others around the world not to make the very hard choices they need to make right now if they're going to survive as independent sovereign states in a world dominated by predatory empires.
Natalie, you're nodding, but I mean, can you really be at the table as a middle power rather than on the menu without the same kind of power as the great powers?
I mean, it's clear that European countries acting individually are not middle powers. They're just not powers at all. They're tiny powers. They're irrelevant powers. However, it is obvious that Europe united, and I deliberately say Europe united, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but Europe united, of course, right? Now, I think, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is completely wrong when he basically says, forget Europe defending itself without America. It would mean spending 10% GDP on defense. It doesn't mean spending 10% GDP on defense. If Europe were to have the same capabilities of the United States, that would mean spending 10% on GDP on defense. But that's not the aim. The aim is to be able to defend ourselves against Russia, that, frankly speaking, has not been able to occupy more than 20% of Ukraine in, 12 years of war, basically. So that Europe united, of course it can be at the table. Now, I therefore come back to what Europe are we talking about? Because I think, underlying the question that you were asking about institutions, thinking about the global level and the UN, you could almost ask the same question at a regional level. Do existing institutions, the European Union, NATO, institutions that, to come back to Bob's point about rules and power being two sides of the same coin, those institutions were basically established within a particular configuration of power. That configuration have gone. Can those institutions survive a different configuration of power? And what is obviously very early to tell, but what I do see is that actually most of the dynamism in Europe tends to happen, even collectively, tends to happen outside existing institutions. Coalitions of the willing, the group of countries that decided to sort of, be a little bit more forthright when it comes to Greenland. It's not a coincidence that it's not coming from the EU, it's not coming from NATO, because these are institutions that were born and were made for a different era.
Do you think China has shown Europe the way to deal with Trump? That when it came to the tariff threats, they matched it, Trump backed down, Trump chickened out. Should Europe be doing the same?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that probably Canada or Mexico or even India are better examples, because the China comparison with Europe inevitably runs into the counter argument of, again, to sort of use a Trumpian expression, China's the one with the cards, right? Now, Europe does not have the same cards vis-a-vis the United States that China has. And so, fair enough, China used its cards because it had them. I find that, and this is why I deliberately kind of, refer to Mexico, or Canada. Here we're talking about countries which are weaker than the United States in different ways, just as dependent. And yet they, over the course of the last year, if you take the European reaction up until the Greenland point, I think Greenland, the question mark is whether that represents a turning point. But up until the Greenland point, you basically had the Mexicans, the Brazilians, the Canadians, the Indians actually demonstrate greater firmness, really. Essentially saying these are red lines and no, we will not go beyond. And each and every time that an actor has done that, Trump has reacted to that, right? Now, Europeans had tried over the course of the last year the opposite method, right? It was Keir Starmer's regal invites breaking protocol. It was Chancellor Merz's birth certificates. It was Giorgia Meloni's pretty little smiles. It was Alex Stubb's golf gaze. None of that worked. A year ago, we could say, well, there's a legitimate question. Will it work? Will it not? After a year, we can only conclude that the Scheinbaums and the Carneys and the Modis, again, let's put China to one side, actually achieved more than the Stubbs and the Merz and the Starmers. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that maybe we have to change our tactics. Now, the question is whether Greenland represents that watershed. Have we learned that essentially when we basically say, these are our red lines, we're going to stand up to those red lines, we know that we will be hurt more than you will, we will hurt you less than you will be able to hurt us, and yet we're willing to take the pain. When we do that, what happens? Market reacts, and when market reacts, then Trump backs down, right? So I hope that the lesson that we will have learned from all of this is maybe we don't have China's cards, but even with the fewer cards that we do have, if we learn to play them in a different way, we're actually going to get better results.
Robert, do you think Trump supporters are getting what they wanted here, or did they have no idea that this is where they would end up?
Trump is simply power mad. He wants to get as much power for himself and also recognition, etc. But I don't think he thinks very much about he's under the illusion that the United States is omnipotent, and that if he just sends an armada someplace or if he threatens a tariff, then the rest of the world will just go along. And I think what he doesn't realize is that American power is not just it does not just derive from raw military and economic power, although those are important. It really does stem from a relationship that the United States has had with much of the world, in which that world has not only tolerated, but legitimized and even supported American power in all its many dimensions. We have not yet lived in a world where not just Russia and China, who, by the way, are not going to join in the carving up of the world with the hostility to the American order in Russia and China persists. But now we will have not only them turning against us, but as Amitav says, you'll now have other powers who used to be American allies will not be American allies and will be balancing against the United States. And that will lead to a much weaker and more vulnerable America. And this is something that I don't think Donald Trump has any understanding of, but I hope that there are people in Congress and at large in the United States who understand this, because it is going to lead to a weakening of the United States in the medium term.
Right. But what do you make of his use of military action then? There's a big difference between seizing Maduro with some special forces and sending an armada to Iran. Is Trump dragging this new world order closer towards great power wars?
Yes, he is. But now, I mean, he only is using military power at this moment against people who can't shoot back. And that's why, countries like Russia and China don't really, I don't think they're very worried about what Trump will do to them. But, if you deal with a country like Venezuela, which has no capacity to defend itself against the United States, if you deal with a country like Iran, whose air defenses we never took out, but the Israelis took out, and therefore is vulnerable to American attack, sure. What you can accomplish with these things, I don't know. The Venezuela story is yet to unfold. I don't know what he thinks he can accomplish in the case of Iran. But the fact that oh, by the way, a lot of this is domestically oriented for the United States. Trump and his people, like Stephen Miller, are trying to militarize America. And a lot of this use of force overseas has got domestic purposes. Ultimately, he wants to use the American military at home. And that's another thing, if I may say so, that a lot of the rest of the world is not understanding. We are heading into dictatorship if we are not already in dictatorship here in the United States. If you look at what happened in Minnesota, I believe that is a precursor to what is going to be happening across the country. And so a lot of what Europe is expecting is that, well, Donald Trump will go away and then we'll all go back to normal. And I think people need to understand that America is in much deeper trouble than maybe they understand, and that we may not be getting out of this anytime soon.